So our speaker today is Ola Michalec, who is lecturer in digital futures, which I thought was a great title for your future chair as well, no doubt. She's based at University of Bristol. And she's a social scientist with a background in BSc Geography and Geology, which I thought was really interesting, particularly for this group. Her research interests are in the making of digital technologies, and her work is informed by questions and concepts from science and technology studies, which is also an area that I'm really interested in. So she currently sits within the cybersecurity research group at Bristol, and she's going to speak to us today about her work on the use of digital twins within the energy sector. And her talk is titled Developing Digital Twins in the Energy Sector, in the Energy Industry, Lessons for Innovators, Policymakers and Infrastructure Projects. So I'll hand over to Ola, and we're really looking forward to a talk today. And thanks so much again for agreeing to speak to us.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really good to be here and nice to reach out to the community of geographers. Again, it's been a while. Hi everyone, it's me, I'm Ola Michalec. I'm a researcher and lecturer based at Bristol University. So this is a presentation from a project I've started in September 2023, where I have been embedded at an organization called Energy Systems Catapult, which is like an UK-based innovation incubator and policy think tank on all things energy. And I've been a so-called researcher in residence there, which means that I had access to various organizations and workshops, and been watching how the industry is evolving from the close-up. So as Katrin said, I'm a holistic social sciences, mostly drawing from STS. And I guess what I found about STS recently is that I kind of hit a wall with the field when it comes to its interest in energy. I found that STS is super interested in the making of technologies, the making of the digital stuff, but with regards to domain expertise, especially energy sector, actually, it's kind of like lacking. So I found myself increasingly reading more and more within human geography. So I was like actually, doing this kind of circular journey back to geography where I've started. So I was like, oh, okay, it's interesting how these things go, I suppose. So I wanted to speak back to this community and see where is digital energy geographies at the moment, and where is the conversation happening, and what's next for this growing field. So in this talk, I will be exploring with you what are the promises of digital twins in the context of energy industry, and how practitioners involved in energy transitions have been interacting with those promises. So to start, maybe let's try to define what digital twins are. And I guess, again, judging from attending countless industry and academic presentations, is one of those words where every community has its own definition, and that's okay. To some people, it's simply a buzzword with no particular tech stack inherently attached to it, something that people use to leverage funding, when the kind of climate is right for it. But then there's also been quite a lot of efforts for people to come up with a community definition. And here, for example, the definition that Energy Systems Catapult states that digital twins is a digital model which integrates two-way data flow between the model and a physical object of the system. We're making a change to one country to the other, for example, a control center network map, which displays real-time system status and enables engineers to control assets to mitigate issues. So we've got all these definitions about this idea of two-way data flow between the real thing and the twin. We've got this idea of kind of detailed model of an entity or the process, and this idea of, again, real-time or right-time data sharing to make better decisions. And again, here, regardless of what your personal definition or opinion on digital twins is, I think it's still a case that is worth researching, given that developers and governments are spending currently millions of pounds and euros in R&D in recent years for this sole topic. So in doing so, I'm taking hype as an analytical category in itself, and I try to understand how hype works within the context of digital twins. So I'm not trying to only dismiss it as something that kind of will hopefully go soon, but try to understand why digital twins have been so attractive to investors in the first place, who are the main actors involved in it, and whether their feelings have changed over time on the issue. Okay. So the question here will be, why would it matter that innovators, policymakers, research funding will be friendly digital twins? So I'll be arguing that digital twins hype matters because it does four things. First, it mobilizes people, energy, and resources. Second, leads to disappointment once some pretty obvious operational issues will show. Third, it allows for a quiet realignment of priorities. And finally, it conceals certain energy governance features that I think might be out. That's the fourth point, would be the most interest to geographers. And now it's important to note that I think this concealment of politics is not necessarily an action of kind of this sort of cartoon big tech villain. I know that it's, you know, in human geography and critical data studies and platform urbanism, we talk a lot about, again, corporate capture of public services. But I think it's like something slightly different happening here. It's more often is the case that energy industry stakeholders are simply rushing to agree on something, and they kind of see this the need for pragmatism, the need for a quick arrival at decisions, so that they can get something done. And that's, you know, that still means that people might be skirting over the questions of, you know, who will win or who will lose from these initiatives. But I think that's precisely this creating opportunities for us as social scientists to raise those questions. Okay, so in order to frame my presentation, I will be sharing briefly some snippets from previous research on promises, expectations, and hype coming from STS. So again, the 4 points I've mentioned about hype and digital twins have been largely described in the literature already, so I'm not really claiming theoretical novelty. I'm just trying to see how the literature is applying to this particular empirical case study of digital twins in the UK energy sector. So some examples of previous research. For example, Neil Pollock and Robin Williams from Edinburgh University looked at Gartner consultants, who are the sole people who came with this famous hype cycle curve. And by the way, there's no scientific basis for this cycle. There's no evidence that innovations necessarily go through these stages in this sort of shape. And actually, during interviews with Gartner consultants, they admitted that their role was about creating an impression of correct prediction of the future. So since, you know, as you can imagine, predicting the future of innovation trajectory is inherently difficult or even impossible, consultants would always be engaging in this periodical renaming of the technologies, that they cannot be ever held accountable for their predictions. If you were to look at, say, a prediction from 5 years ago. So for example, smart cities, connected cities, and then IoT planning would be shape-shifting and kind of renaming each other and then moving on this hype cycle curve so that they couldn't be easily traced over the years. And I think we can see a similar trend with the digital twins because the tech stack, it really varies. It can be anything from VR, GIS, dashboards, communication platforms, modeling software, sensors, and many others. So it's, you know, there's no kind of single material entity that digital twins represent. And then coming back to the 3 key functions of hype. So the 3 main things I like to draw here from previous studies is, first of all, this idea that hype mobilizes and enrolls stakeholders. Again, that's usually happening from ambiguity or buzzwords, revolutionary promises, and appeals to inevitability. Second, in the previous innovation, scholars argued that software entrepreneurs are engaging in this kind of continuous realignment of their promises when pitching their visions to policymakers. So they simultaneously would evoke a long-term societal ambitious visions, but also then at the same time, they would deliver a mere prototype of future technological solutions. And then if these promises wouldn't be realized, funders would pivot to another case studies with another buzzwords, while often portraying this initial faithfulness to these public mission statements. So yeah, so just kind of these practices support each other, and you know, in this framing, innovators can never lose because failure is now lessons learned, and the prototype is a reason for celebration rather than a reason for impatience. And then I guess a third criticism from STS is that hype distracts us from serious and infrastructural work requiring mundane efforts, and instead it promises us simple fixes and silver bullets. So I think anyone who has been researching on working with aging public IT infrastructures and then have been comparing this to the to the narratives about IT, so say reports like the UK's AI Action Plan, I think, you know, if you compare these 2 things, you would easily see the dissonance between the technologies that are currently needed to be maintained, upgraded, and then technologies that are promoted by the venture capital economy. And so finally, I'd like to share an observation about how we should be telling stories about hype. So here I like to agree with Vasilis Galanos from Sterling University, who are arguing that we should be fleshing out the complexities in the stories of the hype. We should be talking about multiple perspectives and effectively write stories that are longitudinal, open-ended, and dynamics. And it's, again, this is because innovations don't follow this neat adoption curve, and they don't really follow this kind of neat curve of a hype cycle. And, you know, we also need to be challenging these popular terms like, you know, AI standards or winter, for example. So now a little disclaimer here, Vasilis's work is quite historical. He traces AI hype from 1950s, but in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the past few years of digital twins, kind of slightly different time horizon, but hopefully still you'll get something out of it. Okay, so the second body of literature I'm drawing from is critical data studies. So I'd say on the digital twin specifically, there's fairly modest number of articles which explicitly call the analysis as analysis of digital twins, but that's okay because we can draw from lots of similar studies. So to give you some examples of previous critical digital twin studies, Michelle Westerlaken from Cambridge University shows how digital twin applications promote reductionist and fragmented model biodiversity, effectively deprioritizing engagement with local citizens and local issues, and instead it privileges a view of the biodiversity, which is something that is better to calculate at international or global scale. Next, a very interesting paper from Jana Boeva, which analyzes a case study of a company called Autodesk, which is also owns Acrobat, and you know, the one that does PDFs. And Autodesk is essentially a platform for so-called building information modeling, which is another name for digital twins but used in construction architecture sector. And her recent paper shows that mass adoption of Autodesk software in construction industry follows a platform logic where near monopolist oversight of the sector, lock-in through software subscription models, and total control over data, format standards, and even training requirements for engineers and architects. Is again trying to reconsider what's the future of architecture and future of construction if one company has so much power. So now, as you can see, that most previous research on digital twins comes from other sectors, which I think is fine. And again, there are many transferable lessons to the energy industry. But I think there is still a gap in sector-specific understanding that is worth addressing. So I'd like to make here a modest proposal to make critical energy data studies happen. So what I mean by that, I think we need to look closer at the energy infrastructure itself, as this is where the bulk of decarbonization will be hopefully taking place. And I think this is empirically and conceptually different from literatures on smart cities, smart homes, or emissions in AI and data centers, because energy infrastructures are governed and owned in a different way to homes or tech sector. So I think that the future socio-technical or critical research on energy digitalization should be, first of all, attentive to the underpinning safety critical and legacy infrastructures, again, very different technologies from, say, smart cities or IoT. Second, this sort of research should be understanding of the complexity of actors across private sector, government, and citizens. Again, here going beyond the critiques of big tech. Third, this research should be committed to decarbonization of the grid. Hopefully that's kind of understandable. And fourth, I think a research that should assume good faith from the practitioners and offer constructive criticism. So I think it's definitely a lot of room for being critical, for being political, but I'm also not seeing myself as a researcher who is doing some sort of investigative journalism and you know, kind of talking to people so I can call them out on something later on. Okay, so here's a summary of the methods. So for the past several months, I was engaged in a multi-site ethnography, which means that I have immersed myself in this world of digital twins through attending lots of industry events, conferences, interviews, basically any opportunities I had, I would speak to people, whether that's online or in person. And I guess the reason why I call it multi-site is because there's no single physical place where digital twins are developed, and the community itself is quite distributed and comes from many different organizations, both public and private. And so for me, it was really important to sign up for all sorts of things, those webinars, launch meetings, advisory boards, you name it. And I've been incredibly helpful to be part of that researcher and resident scheme because of simply leveraging access. And I have also been on the advisory board for the Alan Turing Digital Twin Network and SIGN, which is like a Scottish-led energy infrastructure project on digital twin. So it was really good to kind of attend all and be part of these initiatives. So be always informally using them as an opportunity for that constructive criticism, while not necessarily flagging any papers, just kind of speaking my mind to practitioners or academics. So before we move onto the analysis, I'd like to briefly sketch the background to energy digitalization in the UK. So I think most of you will be familiar with this. I'm not going to spend much time in here. So first motivating force for digitalization is the recent electrification of the sector, which in practice means more assets, more intermittency, more complexity. And from that, we have seen the so-called presumed open data license condition, which was made a requirement by Ofgem to the energy network operators, and that was following the Catapult's guidance, actually. And now energy network companies have to triage and share the data as much as practically feasible. So more recently, last year, we have seen Ofgem's move to consulting on data sharing. So last year, there was consultation on data sharing for consumer consent, and then also kind of business-to-business data. So that's, again, on the horizon, something that I think will be changing very drastically over the next few months. Not a major change is that the previously privately owned National Grid ESO, so Energy Systems Operator, is now in public hands with the similar name, National NESO, so National Energy Systems Operator. So the word grid is taken out. And yeah, again, what it means is that a nationally owned and independent public body responsible for planning of the electricity and gas networks. And NESO, interestingly, has been using this language of digital twins over the past few months and has been working on effectively a digital twin project that you can see on the slide called the Virtual Energy System. And again, what this project, it wasn't quite about building a digital twins at the time, but it was more about identifying relevant use cases for the sector and developing a so-called common framework demonstrator that is common language and processes that would enable interoperability in the sector. So a very, very brief prehistory of digital twins in the context of other industries. So again, it's something that was quite curious. Every single industry talk on digital twins I've attended would mythologize its origin. And it's something that took place during the Apollo 13 mission in the 1970s. And again, a quick reminder of what the mission was. The mission was supposed to be the third time humans would stood on the moon. However, due to the oxygen tank explosion, the astronauts had been looping around the moon for a few days, but eventually they made a safe return. Narrow escape. And at the time, no one talked about digital twins as technologies which then saved the day. But actually, NASA, in the later retelling of this exact same story, would say things like, in response to Apollo's oxygen tank explosion and subsequent damage to the main engine, NASA employed multiple simulators to evaluate the failure and extend the physical model of the vehicle to include digital components. This so-called digital twin was the first of its kind, allowing for continuous ingestion of data to model the events leading up to the accident for forensic analysis and exploration of next steps. So even NASA is very much adopting this language and claiming that this thing developed in 1970 was the digital twin. So now, fast forward a few decades, there are several, again, quite different technologies in terms of the tech stack or products which people refer to as digital twins. So if you're a company like Autodesk, this might be a 3D version of CAD software. If you're a company like Meta, it's about the 3D model that people can engage via the VR headsets. If you are NVIDIA, it's about really any computationally intensive model which would justify selling more GPU chips. And again, to urban planning startups must be something about revamping established GIS software, so it looks a little bit more interactive, or maybe it uses novel data. So in terms of popularity of digital twins, a few policy moments are worth mentioning. So in 2016, the government mandated that public sector which procures construction projects, they all must be using BIM for delivery of these projects. In 2018, the so-called Centre for Digital Build Britain was set up as a collaboration with the government and Cambridge University and a consultancy called Arup. And during the operation, they've released several position papers, lots of kind of governance, ethics principles, and mobilized over 150 members in the Digital Twins Hub, who regularly attend conferences or weekly meetings together. So I'm just going to have a little drink. Fast forward a few years, in 2022, a document called Cyber-Physical Infrastructure Vision was released, which was essentially a document made by this independent body of roboticists, both academic and private sector. And again, the document was really, the document simply set up a vision for the need for cyber-physical system and a public investment for that. And the document was really successful in the sense that it led to a personal response from the former Minister for Science, Research and Innovation, the previous Conservative government. And the minister committed to a public consultation, and there was just like a little bit more noise about digital twins at the time. However, soon after, the momentum around digital twins slowed down a bit again. And this is mostly because digital twins did not make the cut for the so-called 5 critical technologies. So the government, each kind of budget round, it nominates these 5 critical technologies. So this time, this is AI, engineering, biology, future telecoms, semiconductors, and quantum. And I guess these 5 critical technologies, they just strategic priorities where the government decides we're going to give you, billions of pounds rather than millions. So it's like a, different scale of investment. So that was a little bit of a blow to the digital twin community there at the time. And in our interviewees recalling the event, in their opinion, that they did not win because of a lack of a clear vision at the time. And I guess lack of a clear vision here is important because digital twins are easier to explain in these tangible industrial contexts like robotics, manufacturing, or building, where people literally talk about creating fine-grained models of real things and with real-time feedback loops and actuation, like say airplane engine. But in the past 2 or 3 years, the definition has been stretched to include all sorts of different things like say national level energy policy scenarios, home retrofits, decisions about where to place electric vehicle charging points. So quite kind of disparate ideas. And in short, these domains are not just more complex, but they simply holistically different from closed engineering systems, and they cannot in fact be reduced to a closed system. And historically, this is not the first time we're hearing those analogies between computer systems and biological or social entities. Over 20th century, a field known as cybernetics came up with an ambitious and this, supposedly universally applicable theory of systems and control. And this is where we get all this language of feedback, black box, or self-regulation. And those, some of these concepts are still found useful even today. The field fell out of favor over 1960s. And I'm not going to kind of tell you the details of that, but I really recommend Adam Curtis' documentary, All Watched Over by the Machines of Loving Grace, where Adam Curtis makes these researchers the fall of cybernetics. And essentially, he's saying that there were, at the time in the early 20th century, there were lots of quite poor quality ecology studies, which implies there is such thing as natural state of balance in animal, plant, and human life. And therefore, this natural desirable state is something that we should be all aiming for. And in fact, there is no such thing as balance in nature, and nature is more chaotic than that. So that's just like, I guess, an interesting thing to note from history. So yeah, the reason why I'm mentioning this in the context of digital twins is that it's important to acknowledge that governments and technologists drew in the past and will be drawing from scientific theories to ensure their proposals are coming across as neutral and objective. And the politics hidden in this way of translating science into public is the tacit assumption that this natural and desirable balance is whatever the current political or value system is. So I think it's important to consider that as we see innovators proposing digital twins of entities that are completely different from, say, control systems or those closed systems. Okay, so now I will zoom into the analysis of digital twins hype in the energy sector. So I've arranged it into 4 stages: mobilization, disappointment, realignment, and concealment. And 2 caveats here: I'm not claiming generalizability to other technologies here. This is simply kind of a narrative device to let me tell you a chronological story of the hype. And second, the issue is still open to future shifts. So by no means it's a finished story, and hopefully there will be more chapters to it. So let's start with the mobilization. So in the first stage, participants told me that they explicitly kept the mission statements and funding calls as vague to attract a so-called broad church of people and inspire them with ambitious visions. In the meantime, Arup, the same consultancy which worked with Cambridge on this Digital Build Britain Centre, did a scoping study which at the time identified 17 energy-specific digital twin projects. And at the time, we also had the virtual energy system, so the demonstrator of the future replica of energy system I mentioned a few slides earlier. And here, demonstrators are critical to the understanding of innovation culture. This is because grand visions like creating a replica of the entire UK grid, they do not really have to be realized as long as they demonstrate it. And what this means technically is that in this case, pilot projects demonstrated elements of the technical feasibility of the larger idea. So for example, that the code is running when you apply Bayesian modeling to predict scenarios using dummy data, or that it's possible to create attractive visualizations for predictive maintenance, again, using dummy data. And I think this leads to the crux of the problem, namely working with real data from energy companies, which, yeah, it will be proving to be really, really difficult. So at this first stage, we also saw a lot of discussions about data ethics. And here a very particular version of data ethics was promoted, which was mostly about agreeing on high-level principles, and mostly the principles were held, the responsibility was held at the software developer level. And the kind of proposed solutions were about removing biases, improving end-user trust, or representing phenomena with data in accurate ways. So moving to the second stage, I've noticed that while my informants were excited about those pilot projects in conferences and webinars, in private, they actually revealed lots of impatience with this demonstration culture and argued for a proper strategic mandate from the government. I think there's like a very inherent juxtaposition between in the government presentations about vision for digital twins for like 2030 and beyond, yet funding actually has always been confirmed for mere pilot projects, which would often be taking shape of a few week-long sprints, which, yeah, it was strange. So there was no kind of middle ground, you know, how do we scale from the pilot to realize this massive vision over the next 10 years or so? So I did several candid interviews with innovators who simply admitted they were struggling with developing a business model for digital twins in the reality where it's difficult to work with the real industry data. So, you know, I heard at the time plenty of calls for setting up a central office for orchestrating data sharing, or mandating data sharing by government to a larger extent, or making this a strategic priority. And what this means in practice, this move to coordinate data sharing will be done by a communal trusted solution. And in practice, there will be a secure API-enabled platform where users will log in and access data in standardized formats. So what happened next? I've noticed a subtle shift in around a year ago, from discussing digital twins as pilots to talking about digital twins as ecosystems or infrastructures for data sharing, rather than initial definitions of new models or kind of new generations of models and simulators. And in multiple conferences, I've noticed speakers, mostly from the government, cautioning that the government is not building digital twins, as in models, but they are setting up the rules of the road for the future, that is, rules for interoperability. And I think the involvement of the government-led program has been critical to position the initiative as fair, neutral, and leveling playing fields, and being careful about commercial interests of the parties involved. And closer to home, often has recently consulted on so-called data sharing infrastructure, and we can only expect a few next steps in a few months' time. So I think reflecting on the hype, I think it's this quite convenient ambiguity of digital twin buzzword allows stakeholders to effectively quietly realign their priorities from models to interoperability, while actually externally projecting this natural progression of the program and kind of like quieting any doubts or kind of existential worries. And with regards to interoperability, actually, one of the participants said, you should write a critical paper on the need for caution terminology. Digital twin agenda was never about a total cybernetic system, but about interoperability. So it seems like an energy sector, people always say this idea that why do we talk about models again? Hadn't we already talked about models enough to talk about data sharing? But what's interesting about interoperability, that it's also soon, I think, becoming a buzzword. So it's, again, something that has been expressed in multiple ways in the sector. So to some people, it's a policy vision for mutually beneficial cross-organization collaboration. To others, it's a legal intervention to prevent monopolization and incentivize fair competition. Then to others, it's again about technical metadata standards to enable all parties understand the meaning of the data in the same way. So what's interesting is that policymakers or lawyers and technologists, they tend to discuss these ideas in separation, which I think limits the ability to see politics hidden in databases, software architectures, and data formats. And I think this inability to see politics in data brings me to the final stage of analysis, that is this notion of concealment of ethical and political issues related to digital twins. So just to give you an example of how siloed the conversations are, first, there are several lawyers involved in a digital twin hub who commented on the possibility of translating the EU Interoperability Act to the UK and on the need to agree on the data sharing agreements, understanding the price of data sharing and effects on fair competition. But then on the other hand, we've got a group of computer scientists at Alan Turing Institute, a special interest group who are interested in interoperability, but only at semantic level. So only that's only to do with arriving at accurate ways of sharing metadata and developing programming languages that will allow you to do that. And these groups don't really talk to each other. So they express the willingness to talk to each other, but they haven't seen them doing that yet. So the energy sector is in a very interesting place. What used to be a fairly stable engineering industry is now slowly entering into collaboration with software industries. And on the engineering side, we've got a world of maintaining messy legacy systems, data in obscure formats, and an interest in keeping things operational. But on the software side, we see companies seeking market opportunities, procurement contracts from the government, and a drive to experiment with data. So I think these clashes of engineering and software worlds is precisely what we need to look at to understand the challenges and the potential of digital twin in energy. So understanding those new entrants from the IT world, the relationships they might intermediate, and the powers they might gain should be the key to understanding the future politics of energy. And on the notion of anticipating the future, I'd like to bring a few provocations to consider as future topics to watch. So first of all, this changing role of energy suppliers who are having more customer interaction that goes beyond billing customers. So for example, anything to do with the energy saving sessions, time of use tariffs, then changing role of energy networks, perhaps where they will be acting as gatekeepers or facilitators due to enabling data access. Again, changing role of regulators to what extent that they're preventing regulatory capture and unfair competition. Any issues regarding consumer energy data sold to third parties, as this is something that often has been pretty much consulting on a year ago. Was the future of servitization of domestic energy? Can we have something like heat as a service, EV charging as a service, anything else? Will we end up with smart home gadgets which are dependent on software upgrades and additional charges for software licenses? Again, will we ever end up in a situation called monopoly of a backend, where there will be government contracts drawn between government and third-party software suppliers for building data sharing infrastructures? And again, what's the future of energy companies themselves? If they increasingly are turning into software companies rather than kind of old school engineering companies, how is going to be reflected in hiring, skills base, and even company culture over the next few years? And here, just a quick mention of a few consultations I've been involved in. I don't want to kind of like read too much of the slides, but I was mentioning the consumer consent solution. So again, something that is, I think, definitely on the cards. And here in this consultation, we have mostly lead that is important to clearly define what are the use cases of consumer data sharing, with whom, and keep communicating that clearly to the people. And it's not so much about convincing citizens or lay audiences that they should be sharing data, but actually involving a two-way dialogue. On the data sharing infrastructure, something interesting that we found about the National Energy Systems Operator, back when it was called National Grid Energy Systems Operator, so it was owned by the private company, often did audits of the IT infrastructure. And at the time, the audit found that, I think, over 93% of the IT infrastructure is done well over the budget. But they basically weren't really happy with the way they managed their own IT. And now Ofgem is suggesting that they new version that the kind of publicly owned NISA should be managing the kind of IT data sharing transition. So I guess to me, this risen lots of questions about what's the transparency in it, and to what extent is National Grid's ESO the same company in terms of assets, in terms of people, as the new iteration of it. And yeah, just lots of kind of uncertainties from my side. And on the consultation on AI and energy, again, a plea for the energy sector to view AI as a global supply chain market, which is extremely speculative, that we should be careful while claiming that AI will bring energy efficiency to the sector. And actually, we should be really verify these claims, and that any kind of assurances of the benefits of AI should be also coming with evaluations of harms or risks. So again, I saw quite a few kind of government commissioned reports where consultancies will be writing, 50 pages of benefits. Again, very speculative benefits of digital twins, but there will be no cost analysis. And even, we can critique cost-benefit analysis, kind of like positivist, insufficient, but it's really weird to me that government, it would be only commissioning reports that look at benefits without looking at any kind of issues, let's say. And finally, on AI copyright, not energy sector specific, but I think it's still within the same kind of framework of understanding on the need to understand better how should be the legal agreements looking between data sharing. That's whether that's business to business, business to consumer, business to public, or something else. And who should be really bearing the burden of that, and what should be the price of it. So some future plans. I've got a peer-reviewed paper in review on this topic I was just talking about for the last half an hour. Hopefully it will be out soon. I'm also collaborating with an author called Johnny Heath on a series of short stories and poetry inspired very loosely by digital twins. There's a poem about Apex Twin, so this is how loosely it's inspired. It's not a corporate book, and it will be out in maybe about a month time, and then we'll run an event in spring in Bristol. We also doing a card game called Oblique Strategies for Digital Twins. So this is pretty much inspired by Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt Oblique Strategies game, if you have heard about it. And again, kind of wanted to run with this idea of translating the research outcomes into something that is not a paper, but it's kind of easy to read, easy to access, and something that is hopefully interactive, but it's not quite data ethics game. I don't want to really promise people that I'm going to improve the ethics of politics, but I want to kind of maybe be more of a Trojan horse, put the ethics, but maybe not put them in a kind of right front and center of the initiative. So yeah, all of these things will be out soon, in a few weeks' time, hopefully. And finally, a really exciting conference we're organizing with a couple of colleagues on hype studies in Barcelona in September. So if you're interested, let me know. I think these are the references for today's talk and our email. And thank you for your attention, for listening. I want to stop sharing now.
Thank you so much for that. That was really, really great and so interesting.